Sir, step aside. We need to speak with that individual now.
Do you have a judicial warrant to enter this classroom?
We have authorization. Are you refusing to cooperate?
They say true courage is rarely loud. It isn't a battle cry or a dramatic speech. True courage is the quiet, terrifying decision to stand between a looming threat and the people you care about. It is the refusal to move when every instinct screams at you to run. Today's story is a masterclass in exactly that kind of courage. It's a profound reminder that when systems fail, humanity must step in to hold the line. Imagine you are standing in the exact place you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to do, surrounded by people who respect you. Then, in the blink of an eye, the doors swing open, and a flawed system attempts to strip away everything you have built, based entirely on a baseless assumption. What happened in the hallways of a Midwestern high school on a brisk Tuesday afternoon was caught on camera, and the footage shifted the national conversation forever. If you are ready to hear a story about ordinary people forming an unbreakable shield against institutional overreach, hit that like button, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are tuning in from, and make sure you are subscribed. You will absolutely not want to miss the stories we drop every single week. The unseen architect. Let's step into the shoes of Julienne. She was 34, a brilliant life sciences educator who had dedicated the better part of a decade to the students of Crestview Senior High. Her journey to that classroom was not paved with privilege. Born in a nation fractured by political turmoil, she arrived in the United States as a young child. Her early memories were a patchwork of fleeing instability, navigating the labyrinth of a new culture, and watching her family sacrifice everything just to keep a roof over their heads. She grew up in the bustling heart of the East Coast, attended underfunded public schools, and clawed her way through higher education. She worked grueling late-night shifts to supplement her academic scholarships. By the time she was 18, she had taken the oath of citizenship. She had the naturalization certificate securely locked in a fireproof box in her apartment. She possessed a valid passport, cast her ballot in every local and national election, and had even passed rigorous background checks to serve on the district's crisis management committee. She belonged there. In her classroom, Julienne was nothing short of a visionary. She was the educator teenagers actively sought out when they needed to grasp difficult scientific concepts. She had an extraordinary gift for translating complicated cellular processes into language that resonated with struggling minds. But behind the scenes, the educational bureaucracy was less appreciative. Despite stellar evaluations, her innovative teaching methods were frequently brushed aside during faculty meetings. She was repeatedly overlooked for leadership roles, passed over in favor of peers with lighter resumes and fewer successes. She was deeply respected by her immediate peers, yet practically invisible to the upper administration. She swallowed those quiet indignities and channeled her energy entirely into her students. The intrusion. The clock on the classroom wall had just ticked past 2:40. Sunlight streamed through the second-story windows of the science pavilion, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Julienne was conducting a complex acid-base neutralization lab with a group of upperclassmen. The atmosphere was a blend of intense focus and quiet murmurs. Teenagers leaned over their workstations, carefully releasing liquid from glass tubes, their eyes locked on the subtle color shifts in their beakers. Julienne navigated the narrow aisles with practiced grace. She adjusted a clamp here, offered a word of encouragement there. It was a delicate environment. A single misstep could shatter glass or ruin hours of preparation. She was crouching beside a student's desk, gently explaining the mathematics behind the chemical reaction when the tranquility of the afternoon shattered. A teenage hall monitor appeared in the doorway. His face was entirely drained of color, his eyes wide with a very specific kind of terror. Before Julienne could ask what was wrong, the heavy thud of tactical footwear echoed against the linoleum. 3 figures stepped into the frame of the doorway. They wore heavy tactical vests, utility belts, and dark masks that obscured their expressions. The letters emblazoned across their chests indicated they were federal immigration agents. They had completely bypassed the school's mandatory visitor protocols. They hadn't stopped at the main office. They hadn't signed in, and they hadn't requested an administrative escort. They had marched straight into an active learning environment, armed with a piece of paper and an undeniable sense of entitlement. One of the men demanded to speak with Julien, projecting his voice over the sudden, terrified silence of the teenagers. He claimed to have an administrative warrant, citing an anonymous tip that the teacher standing before them was undocumented and unlawfully residing in the country. The human shield, the disruption sent a shockwave down the corridor. As the agents attempted to step further into the classroom, the dynamic of the hallway completely transformed. A geometry teacher next door heard the commotion and stepped out. A literature instructor from across the hall followed suit. Within seconds, the principal of Crestview High, a veteran educator named Marcus Thorne, arrived at the scene. Thorne was a man of quiet authority, deeply committed to the idea that a school is a sanctuary for learning, not a staging ground for law enforcement overreach. He immediately positioned his body squarely in the doorway, creating a physical barrier between the masked men and Julien's classroom. The agents demanded he step aside, waving their administrative document. But Thorne understood the law. He calmly but firmly explained the boundaries of legal consent and lawful stops. He pointed out that an administrative warrant is essentially a document generated by an agency. It is not a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Without a court-ordered mandate or explicit consent, they had absolutely no legal right to trespass into a private educational space, disrupt learning, and detain a faculty member. The tension spiked. The agents raised their voices, threatening the principal with charges of obstruction. They reached for their radios, calling for additional units. But Thorne didn't flinch, and he wasn't alone. As if pulled by an invisible tether, other educators began to flood the hallway. The librarian, the physical education coach, the guidance counselor. They moved with a silent, synchronized purpose. They didn't shout. They didn't raise their hands in aggression. They simply walked up and stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a dense, unyielding semicircle around the door to the lab. Inside the classroom, Julienne stood paralyzed behind her colleagues. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She thought about her passport sitting miles away. She looked at her students who were staring in horror at the unfolding standoff. She realized in that moment that anything she said could be twisted, so she chose the most powerful weapon she had at her disposal: absolute silence. The security cameras mounted on the ceiling captured the entire ordeal. The footage showed the aggressive posture of the agents juxtaposed against the stoic, unwavering wall of educators. For nearly half an hour, the standoff persisted. The agents tried to intimidate, to step around the human barricade, but every time they shifted, the teachers shifted with them, closing the gaps. It was a profound display of unity, a rejection of bureaucratic bias, and a refusal to let a colleague be taken based on a misjudgment. The retreat and the devastating truth. The deadlock finally broke when the district's legal counsel sprinted down the hallway. The attorneys took one look at the administrative paperwork the agents were holding and shut the operation down. They reiterated what Principal Thorne had already stated: without a judicial warrant and without establishing a reasonable, legally sound suspicion grounded in verified facts, the agents were trespassing. The lawyers explicitly told the men to vacate the premises immediately or face severe legal consequences for disrupting educational operations. Outmaneuvered and legally cornered, the agents finally turned on their heels and marched out of the building, leaving behind a warning that the situation was far from over. The moment the stairwell doors closed behind them, the tension in the hallway snapped. Teachers rushed to embrace Julienne. Students began to cry. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow shock. Principal Thorne escorted Julienne to a private office and immediately put her in contact with a top-tier civil rights attorney. Later that evening, sitting in a sterile conference room, Julienne finally learned why she had been targeted. Her attorney had spent hours pulling records, demanding transparency regarding the so-called anonymous tip. What they discovered was a bureaucratic failure of catastrophic proportions. The agency had received a random, unverified call. Instead of cross-referencing employment records, checking tax documents, or verifying social security numbers, basic investigative steps, they simply ran a name through an outdated database. The system spat out a match, a deportation order from over a decade ago for someone with her exact name and origin. But the file didn't belong to Julienne. It belonged to her identical twin sister. When their family had fled their home country decades earlier, the chaos of the journey had torn them apart. Her sister had been lost to the foster care system, falling through the cracks of a broken infrastructure. Years later, struggling and undocumented, her twin had been swept up in a raid and deported. Julienne had spent her entire adult life carrying the crushing guilt of surviving while her sister vanished. She had buried that grief deep inside, pushing herself to succeed to honor the life her twin never got to live. And now, a flawed system, driven by lazy assumptions rather than facts, had conflated their identities. The agents hadn't bothered to check the fingerprints, the differing dates of birth, or the fact that Julienne had been a verified citizen for 16 years. They saw a name, made a massive misjudgment, and sent armed men to a high school. The ripple effect. That night, a short clip of the security footage recorded on a teacher's smartphone found its way onto the internet. The caption was simple: "This is what protecting your own looks like." By the time the sun rose, the video was a global phenomenon. It dominated morning news cycles and saturated social media feeds. The visual of ordinary educators creating a physical barrier to protect a colleague from unwarranted intrusion struck a massive nerve. Millions of people watched the footage, analyzing the calm defiance of the principal and the unshakable solidarity of the staff. The comment sections were a unified front of outrage and inspiration. Have you ever considered what you would do if someone you respected was suddenly targeted by an unjust system? Would you stand your ground? The internet overwhelmingly agreed. Schools must remain safe havens, and the educators were absolute heroes. For Julienne, watching the footage from the quiet of her living room was transformative. The deep-seated humiliation she felt during the raid evaporated, replaced by a burning, unquenchable resolve. She realized she possessed a unique opportunity. She wasn't just going to fight back for her own dignity, she was going to fight for the sister she lost, for the colleagues who risked their careers for her, and to ensure that this brand of institutional recklessness never infiltrated a classroom again. She gave her legal team the green light. They filed a massive federal lawsuit citing severe violations of her constitutional rights. They targeted the unlawful seizure attempts, the blatant denial of due process, and the reckless reliance on flawed data that pointed to systemic bias. The courtroom battle. Months later, the battle shifted from the school hallway to a federal courthouse. The trial was a masterclass in holding power accountable. The courtroom was packed every single day with advocates, journalists, and former students who had come to support the teacher who changed their lives. The legal proceedings were methodical and devastating to the defense. The prosecution played the viral security footage in high definition, letting the silence of the teachers speak volumes. They brought the federal agents to the stand, forcing them to publicly admit their failures. Under oath, the agents confessed that they had acted solely on a database name match. They admitted they had the technological tools to verify her citizenship in the field, but chose not to use them due to time constraints. They acknowledged they had never bothered to call the school district to check her employment status. It was a staggering display of negligence. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when Julienne took the stand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform for the jury. She simply told her truth. She spoke about the terror of having masked men interrupt a science experiment. She detailed her long, arduous path to citizenship, and then she spoke about her twin sister. The courtroom fell utterly silent as she explained the reality of the database error. She painted a heartbreaking picture of how a system reduces human lives to digital data points, punishing people based on assumptions rather than facts. She exposed the human cost of bureaucratic laziness. The defense scrambled to argue that the agents had operated in good faith, claiming they were simply following up on a tip. But the evidence of their negligence was an insurmountable mountain. They had ignored every safeguard designed to protect innocent citizens. When the jury retreated to deliberate, they didn't take long. They returned with a unanimous verdict, finding the agency liable on all counts of constitutional violations. To send an unmistakable message that rights cannot be bypassed for convenience, the jury awarded Julienne a staggering 8-figure financial settlement. It was one of the most significant judgments of its kind in history. A massive punitive blow designed to force immediate institutional reform. A legacy of action. The fallout from the verdict was immediate. Leadership within the agency was completely restructured. Sweeping policy mandates were instituted, requiring rigorous multi-point identity verification before any agent could even approach an educational facility. Back at Crestview Senior High, a heavy brass plaque was mounted on the wall just outside the biology lab. It read, "In this hallway, we stand united." Julienne didn't walk away from education. In fact, her career flourished in ways she had never anticipated. The administration that had previously overlooked her suddenly recognized her immense value. But she didn't just return to grading papers and running labs. She utilized a large portion of her settlement to establish a powerful legal defense foundation. She funded initiatives that provided specialized training for school districts across the country, teaching educators exactly how to handle unauthorized intrusions and how to protect their constitutional rights. She turned her deepest trauma into a fortress for others. The quiet, overlooked educator became the architect of a nationwide movement, proving that while systems can be deeply flawed, the collective power of ordinary people refusing to back down is an unstoppable force. So I'll ask you this: when the time comes and the system fails the people around you, will you step aside or will you stand in the doorway? If you found value in this story of resilience and solidarity, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. Drop a comment below and let me know which part of this standoff surprised you the most.